I spent 5 years building a perfect revenge plan against my ex-boss who destroyed my career, and when it finally happened, it destroyed everything he had left. This is a wild one, so go ahead and hit subscribe and never miss out on uploads. It all started on a regular Tuesday morning. Except it wasn't regular at all. My boss, Richard Masters, had just called me into his office, and I already knew that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment everything changed. When I stepped into his office, he barely looked up from his computer. Richard always had this air of arrogance about him, like he owned the place. And in a way, he did. At least, that's what he thought. I had been working at Masters & Company for almost 5 years, but that day would mark the end of my career, the beginning of my fight, and ultimately the start of my revenge. Richard didn't waste any time. He slid a piece of paper toward me, a termination letter. My eye scanned it. Poor performance was the excuse, but I knew better. This wasn't about performance. This was about power, control, and him feeling threatened. I had worked under Richard for so long, and I knew how much he hated anyone who was a threat to his position. I had become that threat. "You're not a good fit for the company anymore," Richard said, his voice smooth but cold. "Maybe you'll find something more suitable somewhere else." Just like that. No warning. No previous conversation about my work performance. Just a cold, calculated decision to end my career. I felt the blood rush to my head, the anger rising in me like a tidal wave. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to tell him how much I had sacrificed for this job, how many hours I had worked for this company, only to be discarded like an old pair of shoes. But I didn't. I knew better. That wasn't how I was going to play this game. Instead, I smiled. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice steady, controlled. "I'll clean out my desk." As I walked out of that office for the last time, I knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't a loss. This was just the beginning of what I had been planning for years. The first day without my job felt oddly liberating, like a weight had been lifted. But beneath that sense of relief, there was something darker stirring inside me, something that had been quietly building for years. Richard Masters had ruined my life, my career, my future, and now I was going to make him pay. The next 5 years would be a careful, calculated mission. I wasn't just going to get him fired. I wasn't just going to ruin his reputation. I was going to take everything from him. Every little piece of the life he had built for himself. His business, his relationships, his pride. I was going to destroy him. I started small. I didn't need to act immediately. No, I needed time to build the perfect plan. I took up a job at another company, a rival firm, but it wasn't just about earning money anymore. It was about gathering information. Every move Richard made, every business deal he closed, every mistake he made, I was watching. I was listening. I was learning everything I could about him and his business. I knew what buttons to push. I knew how to play him. At first, it was just about revenge for the pain he caused me. But soon, it became something more. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing him the consequences of his arrogance, his cruelty. It was about watching him lose everything, just as he had done to me. And so I planned. I planned for years. I made sure every detail was perfect. I wasn't going to give him a chance to come back. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. When the time came, I was going to take down Richard Masters, and there would be no coming back from it. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed to surround myself with people who could help me bring him down. I needed people who had been affected by him, who had felt his wrath and were willing to join me in my pursuit of vengeance. Slowly, I built an underground network, former employees, disgruntled clients, competitors who had lost everything because of him. Each one had a reason to hate Richard Masters. Each one had a piece of the puzzle. And together, we would bring him to his knees. As the years went by, I perfected the plan. I watched Richard from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Every business move he made, every time he stepped out of line, I was there, lurking, quietly gathering the pieces of his downfall. My life became a game of patience, a game of strategy. And then, the moment arrived. It was a sunny afternoon when I finally put the last piece of the plan into motion. Richard had just signed a huge deal with a company that he thought would solidify his position at the top. He was on top of the world, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He had no idea that his empire was about to come crashing down. I sent the first wave of my attack, a series of well-timed leaks, each one more damaging than the last. Financial records, business dealings that weren't as legitimate as they appeared, emails exposing his corruption. Slowly, I began to unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. As Richard's world started to crumble, I watched from the shadows, my heart racing with a mixture of triumph and anticipation. But I wasn't done. Not yet. This was just the beginning. By the time Richard realized what was happening, it was too late. The damage was done. He had no idea where the attacks were coming from, but I did. I had orchestrated every move. I had taken everything from him, and he had no one to blame but himself. The days after I set my plan in motion were both exhilarating and terrifying. The adrenaline of watching Richard's empire slowly begin to crack was intoxicating. But I couldn't get too comfortable. I knew that if I slipped up, if I made one mistake, everything could backfire. My revenge had to be flawless. I'd spent 5 years planning this, and I wasn't about to let it all come crashing down because I got careless. Richard had no idea what was happening to him. His business was being systematically attacked. Financial records leaked to the press, clients pulling out of deals, competitors starting to move in. The cracks were small at first, but they were there, and they were growing wider with every passing day. Richard thought he was untouchable. He was too arrogant, too sure of himself to even consider the possibility that someone might be pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the weeks passed, I saw his confidence begin to slip. He was frantic, scrambling to save his company. But every time he thought he had fixed one problem, another one appeared. His employees were beginning to talk. Whispers of misconduct, shady business deals, and underhanded tactics started circulating among his staff. Some of them were loyal, but even they were starting to question his decisions. The very foundation of everything he had built was crumbling, and it felt like I was watching a slow-motion train wreck. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I had a bigger play in mind. I had gathered enough evidence to bring him to his knees. It wasn't just about destroying his business anymore. It was about taking everything from him. His reputation, his pride, and, most importantly, his freedom. I knew I couldn't just rely on leaks and whispers. I needed to take it to the next level. I needed to force him into a corner, make him confront the consequences of his actions. The perfect opportunity presented itself one evening. Richard had arranged a high-profile dinner meeting with a new investor, one who could have saved his sinking company. The meeting was supposed to be his big break, his chance to get back on top. He was so sure of himself, he didn't realize I had already set a trap for him. I arranged to meet the investor before Richard did, under the guise of being a disgruntled former employee. I showed him the evidence I had, financial irregularities, unethical business practices, and the emails I had been collecting for years. I didn't need to make him believe me. The proof was right there in front of him. All I had to do was sit back and watch as Richard's carefully constructed life came crashing down. By the time Richard arrived at the restaurant, the investor was already on my side. He had no idea what was coming. When he walked into the room and saw me sitting there with the investor, his face drained of color. He knew, even before I said anything, that he was about to lose everything. "Sarah?" Richard's voice was shaky, his eyes darting between the two of us. "What the hell is this?" I smiled, a cold, satisfied smile that I had been waiting 5 years to give. "This is the beginning of the end, Richard," I said softly. "You've been running this company into the ground for years, using lies, manipulation, and deceit to climb to the top. Now, it's time to face the consequences." The investor didn't hesitate. "I'm pulling out of the deal," he said, his voice firm. "I won't be associated with a company that's been involved in these kinds of practices. I'll be taking my money elsewhere." Richard's face twisted in shock and disbelief. He tried to protest, tried to explain, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The investor had already seen everything he needed to see. Richard had no one to blame but himself. "Are you really going to let this happen?" Richard asked, his eyes pleading now, his confidence completely gone. "I've built this company from the ground up. You can't just take everything away from me." I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "You took everything from me, Richard. You destroyed my career, my future, and you did it with a smile on your face. Now it's my turn to take everything from you. And trust me, I'm just getting started." Richard looked like he might pass out right there. His entire world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The table that he had worked so hard to build was flipping over, and he was powerless to stop it. The next few days were a whirlwind. The fallout from that dinner meeting was fast and brutal. The investor publicly announced his withdrawal from the deal, and the media picked up on the story. The leaks I had sent to the press had already started to circulate, and Richard's name was splashed across the headlines. The company's stock plummeted. Loyal clients pulled out, and the employees who had stuck by him began to leave in droves. Richard's empire, which he had spent years building, was crumbling before his eyes. But the best part? Richard wasn't just losing his business. He was losing his place in the world. His reputation was in tatters, and he had no one left to turn to. All of his power, all of his connections, evaporated like smoke. His life was unrecognizable. And as I watched it all unfold, I felt a sixth sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted him to feel the same helplessness I had felt when he destroyed my career. I wanted him to lose everything. I wanted him to experience the fear that had kept me awake at night for the past 5 years. The final blow came when Richard was arrested. I had sent all the evidence I had gathered over the years to the authorities: fraud, embezzlement, and corruption, all carefully documented. Richard's world came crashing down, and I was standing right there to watch it. His arrest was the cherry on top of the cake I had spent years baking. But it didn't stop there. I didn't just want to take his business. I wanted him to lose his freedom. I wanted him to feel the weight of every lie he had ever told. And when the day came that he was escorted out of his office in handcuffs, I felt a rush of vindication. I had spent 5 years plotting my revenge, and now I was finally watching it unfold. But as I watched Richard's life crumble, I couldn't help but wonder, what was the cost of all this? Was I any better than he was? The answer, I realized, didn't matter anymore. This wasn't about being better. This was about justice. This was about me getting what I deserved. And as Richard's life fell apart, I knew I had won. It's strange, isn't it? How you can spend years plotting something, perfecting every detail, only to realize that the moment you get what you've been working toward, it doesn't feel as satisfying as you thought it would. When Richard was arrested, when his name was all over the news for fraud, embezzlement, and years of corrupt business practices, a part of me expected to feel elation, maybe even relief. I had spent 5 years of my life building this plan, studying his every move, anticipating his downfall with such intensity that I thought I'd feel victorious, even vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. Sure, I watched as his world shattered. I watched as he was escorted out of his office in handcuffs, his once pristine reputation now smeared across every major news outlet. The power he had held, the confidence he had exuded, all gone. But as I stood there, observing the wreckage of everything he had built, I began to question myself. Had I really won? Richard was humiliated. His company had collapsed under the weight of the fraud, his personal life in ruin, and his freedom taken from him. The very man who had once held my future in his hands now had nothing. He was broken, and I had delivered the final blow. But for some reason, I wasn't celebrating. I was left wondering if this was truly what I had hoped for. In the quiet of my apartment, I couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness that had settled in my chest. It had taken so much to get to this point. I had sacrificed relationships, my peace of mind, even my own happiness, all in the name of revenge. But now that I had succeeded, I was left standing in the ruins, alone with the aftermath. The phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was an email from one of the former employees who had helped me gather information about Richard. I hope you're happy with what you've done. But you should know, the damage is far from over. Richard may have lost everything, but he's not the only one who will pay the price. Those who helped bring him down will be feeling the heat soon. You should be careful. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so focused on Richard's destruction that I hadn't considered the ripple effect it would have on everyone else involved. The people who had worked with Richard for years, those who had been complicit in his schemes, were now turning on each other, desperate to protect themselves. And I was no exception. The people who helped me bring him down were now in danger of being caught in the fallout. I had spent 5 years working alone, meticulously making sure no one else knew the full extent of my plan. But now, the very people who had helped me were at risk. I couldn't protect them forever. And the worst part? I didn't even know if they felt any gratitude for what I had done. I had used them, manipulated them for my own cause. Had I really done the right thing? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal battles, and press coverage. Richard's trial became the focal point of the city's tabloids, and his fall from grace became a cautionary tale. Everyone who had worked with him, everyone who had been even remotely involved in his business, was being investigated. The authorities didn't stop at Richard. They started digging into everyone who had ever been close to him. And the more they uncovered, the deeper the web of corruption became. But I was no longer at the center of it. I had vanished. No one knew I was the one who had orchestrated Richard's downfall. I had covered my tracks too well, and it felt like I was slipping into the shadows. But even in the shadows, I couldn't escape the questions. One evening, I received an unexpected call from a former colleague, someone I had worked with in Richard's company. We hadn't spoken in years, but her voice was familiar. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know who else to turn to. The police are starting to ask questions about the people who were involved in taking Richard down. People are getting scared. I don't know if it was worth it anymore. Everyone's worried about their futures. What if we get dragged into this mess?" Her voice trembled with fear, and for the first time since this all began, I felt a sharp pang of guilt. "What did you expect?" I asked, my voice colder than I meant it to be. "We all knew what we were doing. We knew the risks. But you were the one who had everything figured out," she said, her voice breaking. "You were the one who promised it would be worth it. You promised it would be over when Richard was gone." I didn't know how to answer. She was right. I had promised that once Richard was gone, everything would be better. But I hadn't considered the chaos that would follow. I hadn't thought about the way my own actions would ripple out, dragging others into the mess I had created. I had been so consumed by my desire for revenge that I hadn't considered the collateral damage. As I sat in my apartment that night, staring out the window, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think about before. Revenge wasn't just about making someone pay for their wrongdoings. It was about losing pieces of yourself in the process. Every step I had taken, every decision I had made, had slowly chipped away at my own humanity. I had become obsessed with making Richard suffer, but in doing so, I had lost sight of who I was. The phone rang again. This time, it was Emily, one of the people who had helped me bring Richard down. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said, her voice urgent. "Things are escalating. People are starting to talk. We need to figure out how to cover our tracks." I sighed. This was the moment I had been dreading. The moment I realized that revenge, no matter how perfectly executed, always had a price. And the price wasn't just paid by the person who wronged you. It was paid by everyone who was caught in the aftermath. It was all spiraling out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it. The plan that had taken me 5 years to perfect, the revenge I thought would bring me closure, was now a ticking time bomb. Everyone involved was now at risk, and I was no longer just the one pulling the strings. I was a part of the mess. The aftermath of Richard's destruction wasn't just about him losing everything. It was about how much of myself I had lost in the process. Emily's call was still ringing in my ears as I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone. She had been one of the first people to help me, someone who knew the deep parts of my plan. She had believed in my vision, just like I had once believed in my own idea of justice. But now, she was scared. She didn't want to get dragged into the legal storm that was brewing. Everyone around me was feeling the heat, and all I could think was it worth it? When I met Emily the next morning, she didn't look like the same person who had helped me execute this plan. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, we need to talk about what's next," she said, almost pleading with me. "I'm scared. People are asking too many questions. I don't think I can keep this quiet for much longer." I could hear the panic in her voice. I had never thought about what would happen to the people who helped me, who stood by me as I tore Richard's world apart. But now, seeing Emily's face, the fear, the regret, I knew that this wasn't going to end how I imagined. Revenge had a price, and I had paid it. Now, others were paying it too. I let out a long breath, running my hands through my hair. "What do you want me to do, Emily? The damage has already been done. Richard's gone, his business is destroyed, his reputation in ruins. What else do you think we can do?" Her voice cracked. "I never signed up for this, Sarah. I helped you, yes, but now it feels like we're the ones being hunted. It's not just about him anymore. It's about us too." I could see the guilt in her eyes, and I knew what she was thinking. She was wondering if this was all worth it. If we could ever walk away from what we had done. "We can't just walk away, Emily," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "We made our choices, and now we have to live with them." But even as I said it, I felt the weight of those words crush me. We made our choices. And now, it was starting to feel like there was no escape. The weeks that followed were a blur. Richard's arrest was just the beginning of the fallout. The investigation into his business dealings spread like wildfire. Everyone he had ever worked with, including those who had once considered themselves his friends, was under scrutiny. But the worst part? I couldn't escape it. I couldn't run away from my role in all of it. I had been so focused on taking Richard down that I never considered the consequences of what would happen afterward. I watched as one by one, the people who had helped me started distancing themselves from the situation. They had all turned on Richard, yes, but now they were worried about their own safety, their own future. And I couldn't blame them. In fact, I started to feel the same way. Richard may have been the one in the spotlight, but we were all in this together. We were all complicit in his fall. One afternoon, I got a call from the police. My heart dropped as soon as I saw the number on the screen. It was too early for this, too soon. They were starting to ask questions about me, about my involvement. I knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots, before they found out who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. I had been careful, but I wasn't invincible. "Ms. Andrews," the officer said when I answered. "We need to speak with you about your involvement in the investigation into Richard Masters. Are you available for a meeting?" I could feel the walls closing in on me. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, ma'am. You don't have to answer anything, but we do need to speak with you." I hung up the phone without saying another word, panic gripping my chest. The truth was catching up with me, and there was nowhere to hide. I had spent 5 years carefully constructing my plan, but I never accounted for the aftermath. I never accounted for the guilt or the fear that would come with seeing everything I worked for unravel before my eyes. The next few days were filled with meetings, tense phone calls, and endless stress. Emily had gone underground, keeping her distance, afraid that she too would be caught in the investigation. The people who had helped me bring Richard down were either too scared to talk or too eager to distance themselves from the mess. The weight of my own actions was becoming suffocating. The satisfaction I once felt from seeing Richard's life fall apart had long since faded. Now, I just wanted it all to end. Then came the final blow. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the walls, when I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't the police. I had already dealt with them. This was something else. I opened the door, and there stood a man I didn't recognize. "Are you Sarah Andrews?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady but my heart racing. "Who are you?" "I'm from the state prosecutor's office," he said. "We need to talk." It was over. I had known it was coming, but somehow, hearing it out loud made it all too real. The investigation had reached its peak, and now, they were coming for me. As I sat across from the prosecutor, I realized just how far I had fallen. I had spent years meticulously planning Richard's downfall, but in doing so, I had allowed my own life to be destroyed. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about facing the consequences of what I had done and what I had become in the process. The prosecutor wasn't interested in small talk. He had one question for me. "What was your role in the scheme to take down Richard Masters?" I stared at him, my mind racing. I didn't know what to say. The guilt was suffocating, but I knew I couldn't lie my way out of this. I had to face the music. "I played a part," I said quietly. "But I didn't act alone. I wasn't ready to take full responsibility for everything, not yet. But I knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The price of revenge had been higher than I could have ever imagined. And as the prosecutor leaned in, I realized that even if Richard Masters had lost everything, I had lost far more.